Welcome to the internet. Have a look around.
Internet began back in 1969. It was a tool of the Pentagon. But nowadays, just about anyone with a computer and a modem can join in, usually for a nominal fee.
The internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes.
One danger is this could turn out to be an elitist system, one available only to people with a computer and a modem, and thus widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Your Mac friend, Brent Rambo.
And tomorrow, are the people who urge we prepare for Y2K helping, or could they be inadvertently fomenting fear?
Y2K anxieties are already in evidence.
You guys are like me. You like surfing the internet to see what's up. Did you know that you gotta be careful what you do and where you go out there in cyberspace?
Save surfing!
Your kids can be at risk playing those video games in your own home.
Television had been around, forever. It's been around since the 50s, but the major change was social media.
Social media is destroying our lives.
Social media impedes their children's moral development.
The online world today's teenagers are living in may bring them the fame and fortune they crave, but it can also bring heartbreak and bullying. But what worries parents and experts alike is how these fundamental changes to the way teenagers' brains are wired is going to change the way they live in their wired world.
It's called the Momo Challenge, and it encourages children to commit suicide.
Is to encourage you to go deeper into your child's phone to check things that you or your child may not even know are in there to keep your child safe from child predators. So
the video games, the movies, the internet stuff is so violent. It's so incredible. I see it.
Everything and anything and everything and all of the time.
Hey, Cypher here. I don't think anyone can deny that technology is playing a key role in the US political system, but most really don't understand its full breadth. They tend to focus on the internet or point to conservative media, but we need to take a much further view. We've opened Pandora's box with technological politics. Unlike the utopian visions we once held for things like the internet, the reality was that we let loose the worst of our inhibitions and enshrined a system that prioritizes extremism. Technology has democratized our media, removing the gatekeepers who've kept American civility since the liberal consensus after World War II, and that's a recipe for disaster. As Andrew Marantz says, it's one thing to be a civil libertarian in theory, it's another to start a warehouse party, watch it devolve into feral anarchy, and do nothing to clean it up. We created this system and we chose to polarize. You can say it wasn't your choice, but as the song goes, tech is not the reason, it is the catalyst. This is part 4 on a series that I've been doing on US political polarization. The first episode shows that the party switch set our current political system in motion. The next shows how the culture war implemented a spurious kind of rhetoric that camouflages real issues. Finally, the most recent one shows that the real issue is neoliberalism itself, and the populism that resists it. These things were enough to cause the polarization of American politics, but as we'll see today, it's been greatly accelerated by the incentives of technological development. Bruh, you've done nothing with this series except for strawmanning conservatives, revealing your liberal bias, and showing that you're nothing but a hypocrite. Ah, crypto. It's rather ironic for a straw man to be complaining about strawmanning. But beyond that, you are indeed using the rhetorical tools that conservative media has perfected. Don't have a counter-argument? Call hypocrisy, despite that not changing whether or not your opponent is correct. If your arguments are easily defeated, say you've been strawmanned without bothering to state how. And when all else fails, deny, deny, deny. Liberal bias, fake news, political correctness, or whatever. Those are all simply means to deny reality. Much like hypocrisy, bias does not challenge whether something is true. No, these are all shorthands for rejecting without repudiation. Prior to the 1990s, those claims were essentially useless in political rhetoric, but they are primary means today. I'm not here to please anyone's political sympathies. This is history. If you want it to be fair and balanced, trademark, then you're better sticking your head in the sand. know better than crypto. Instead of talking about racist capitalism, you make it sound like it's all just petty politics. You're really going mask off with this whataboutism and both sidism.
Well, first, Cheka, the terms are red herrings and false equivalency. At least get the terminology correct.
Come on, man.
And considering the sheer amount of crypto types complaining that this series has been, "You've been too mean to conservatives," or in reality, "I despise reactionaries," with all that, you don't have much of a leg to stand on. You're just angry that history doesn't work your way. Now, racism is certainly a problem, and you'll see a lot of it in this episode, but it's not the core issue here. Now, I'm currently writing an episode on systemic racism in America, but that's simply not what's polarizing us. To paraphrase historian Gary Nash, woke scolds like Cheka are about as obsessed with race as the Nazis. On the other hand, capitalism certainly is the root. But to tinkies like you, there is no difference between the types of capitalism. Somehow it's all a bourgeois conspiracy. Neoliberalism is not the New Deal. Obviously. Who could possibly think that those are the same thing besides tankies? It's not going mask off. It's being honest. People like you exaggerate everything purely for the sake of sanctimony. Ideological purity is very much part of the rhetorical polarization released by technological change. All of Cheka's hyperbolic conspiracism only makes matters worse. The sad thing is, it is all petty politics. We're fighting over very small differences. Basically, whether we think we need to remove an establishment of rich people or technocrats. It's really not much, but over these issues, we've managed to become so polarized, we had a president who inspired an attack on the federal legislature, thereby preventing the peaceful transition of power we've held dear in the United States since our founding. That simply wasn't possible a few decades ago.
Oh no, he's serious! You got that knife hand out! Run!
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Now, who knows whether we will get better or worse, which is a discussion that'll have to wait for another time. That's the future. Today we're bringing history all the way to the present, seeing how technology has accelerated American political polarization. As you can tell, this took an absurd amount of time to create, and I don't want to split it up anymore, even if this ends up being longer than an hour.
You what?
And even so, you can go deeper by following the references below. I get comments all the time from people who can't find my bibliography and then claim that I don't have one, or that the books are too difficult to get a hold of. But that just proves they're illiterate jackasses. It's always below, either in the description or pinned comment on every episode, clearly indicated where to find it. And for those who actually want to read the books, but don't want to, buy them, there's such a thing as a library. All of these episodes merely give you a narrative to understand their subject matter. The bibliography is there to give you the most pertinent books for my construction of that narrative and direct you to further reading. Which also means I can't cover everything. If somebody complains that I forgot to cover something, I'm just gonna delete the comment. This is long enough as it is, and I'm bringing the things that I think are the most pertinent. But one thing is for sure. While we chose to polarize, the democratization of media has catalyzed our polarization. Television came of age after World War II, and that was the heyday of the liberal consensus. The news kept that vision. After conservatism had pushed hard against US intervention in the war through the America First movement prior to Japan's sneak attacks, this left conservatism on the outs, and media reflected that. Conservative voices were simply not present in the news for a decade. The few remaining adherents determined that they had to fight this blackout. News simply catered to the consensus rather than creating it, but they functioned as gatekeepers. Publication required major production work, be it books, newspapers, radio, or television, which meant it was difficult to make a profit without massive popularity. Conservatives needed their own outlets, but were not popular. They felt like victims of liberal bias, when it was simply a lack of people who could be marketed to. They turned it into a conspiracy theory, so liberal bias became the public enemy of these post-war conservatives. This was the origin of the new right, but they had to create their own groundswell. The old right had floundered with the disastrous America First movement. The new one sought to make conservatism viable again in an age of liberalism. The only prominent conservatives left were really reactionaries, such as Dixiecrats who sought to conserve Jim Crow against their party that was steadily drifting leftward. The new right had to keep conservative values such as opposition to taxes, social programs, and a so-called loss of tradition and social order. As one prominent New Right publication stated, it stands athwart history yelling stop. These are nebulous values that often cover much darker undertones, such as how social order and tradition often meant backlash against civil rights. It took time for this to coalesce. The Democrats were either liberals or reactionaries, so the nascent New Right turned to Republicans. When Robert A. Taft was passed over for the nomination of the liberal Dwight D. Eisenhower and his running mate, Richard M. Nixon, the New Right felt betrayed. During Ike's presidency, they coalesced as their own form of gatekeeping. Several publications popped up to propagate the New Right's message. There was Human Events magazine, editorialists for the Wall Street Journal, Young Americans for Freedom organizing on college campuses, Henry Regnery's book company, the Mannion Forum on radio and TV, and the most significant of them all, National Review ran by William F. Buckley. They were only kept in existence by private donations from multimillionaires because they almost never turned a profit while publishing primarily conservative media. These New Right leaders attempted to rebirth American conservatism by policing its borders. They had to separate from the Dixiecrats and liberal Republicans. One of the earliest battles to define the New Right was ostracizing Ayn Rand, a wannabe philosopher who'd only recover from the fringe in her later years. Their first national candidate was Barry Goldwater, but when he lost in the biggest landslide election in 3 decades, it was clear conservatives still needed to reevaluate. A group that rose to prominence within the New Right before the election caused the biggest problem: the John Birch Society. They were a bunch of conspiracists trying to fight supposed communists inside the US government.
That the civil rights movement, as we know it today, is simply part of a worldwide movement organized and directed by communists to enslave all mankind. We urge you to continue your studies of these unpleasant truths and gain a more complete understanding of the conspirators' plans to subjugate the United States.
Their leader, Robert Welch, created the society as an autocratic organization to push his wild conspiracy theories, including the crazy idea that Ike was a secret communist.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. They're all commies.
Association with them became poison after the loss of 1964, despite them being the largest conservative organization in the US at the time. Buckley led the charge in removing them. He even gained a TV show because of the popularity of this. But Birchers left their mark. Up-and-coming politicians learned much from their short association, including Ronald Reagan and Phyllis Schlafly, such as the usefulness of red-baiting conspiracism and how it masked far more racist politics.
And inexorably, the people of the United States were being divided according to plan.
So while the New Right maintained their policing of what Buckley called responsible conservatism, reactionary politics remained just below the surface, and the New Right steadily dwindled in subscribership as a result. They had to form ties with newer movements like the religious right and neoconservatives, but with that came less responsible conservatism. Gatekeepers of the left and right kept everything civil as the parties made their final switch both sectionally and politically. The rise of Reagan and Schlafly did much to reinvigorate what historian Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics. The gatekeepers couldn't hold back what these two unleashed. Schlafly fought feminists who pushed the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion. Reagan fought the social liberalism of New Dealers, and the New Left derived from the counterculture and civil rights movements. In order to do so, they resorted to creating the culture war. And in their wake, media technology would reformulate, letting loose the inherent polarization of the sixth-party system. FM radio had been around since the 1930s, but it didn't gain popularity until much later. 1978 was the first year there were more FM listeners than AM. The reason why FM became more popular over time was that it allowed for stereo sound, and therefore was more conducive to music. As stations abandoned the other side of the dial, AM radio switched to content that didn't need stereo to sound better, as in talk radio. Talk stations carried more political and news content. While there were conservatives, they tended to be of the Buckley sort, who prized calm and rational discussion. But that was also while AM remained a fairly niche thing that people rarely tuned into. But the United States has been experiencing a massive demographic shift over the course of the last century. By 1920, there were more people living in cities. We drastically reduced immigration from 1924 to 65, but then loosened it just in time to coincide with the end of Jim Crow, sending white people in the cities, accustomed to less diversity, fleeing for the suburbs, leaving the poverty-stricken black and immigrant population ghettoized. This meant cities tended to be liberal, while rural and white suburban areas remained conservative. So this created a strange incentive for talk radio, since city dwellers don't spend as much time in their cars and have other forms of entertainment at home. They also have easier access to FM radio and therefore music stations, since FM doesn't travel very far, whereas AM can reach the most distant places. The 1980s saw a rapid increase in consumerism as well. As neoliberalism atomized individuality, people began to identify with the products they bought more than their communities. Much like sports fans, this neoliberal consumerism made people hold their products so dearly that they acted as tribes or factions, often to the point of zealotry. On top of that, people could call in to a talk radio station, made possible by the newly accessible toll-free lines, thereby lending a sense of community, because they could take part in the conversation at hand. Caller input was an essential part of the medium. Talk radio gave rural people something to break up the inherent loneliness of communities drained of population and suburbanites fractured by neoliberal consumerism. But radio stations were obligated not to polarize. From 1949, the Federal Communications Commission regulated broadcasts with what's called the Fairness Doctrine. Basically, people could lodge complaints if a station that aired political content did not touch on important topics nor air contrasting viewpoints. This meant no licensed station could be completely devoted to liberalism or conservatism, at least until the federal government repealed it in 1987, something Ronald Reagan had very much pushed for. It took years for this to have an effect, so in the early 1990s, there was an equality of voices on the air still, but that would change. You see, something differed from the previous generation of new right media outlets. This age of radio functioned less on political and intellectual acumen, and more on entertainment value.
And here we are once again having more fun than a human being should be allowed to have.
The first generation of the new right couldn't turn a profit, but the second one could. So what makes for great entertainment is to always be on the attack. Shock jocks spewed fire into their microphones, and made a tidy profit by doing so. Anything they could rail against gave them more money. If they said something too crass, slanderous, or even conspiracist, they could use the outrage that generated for more content as they assailed political correctness. The culture war came to the airways quickly, for it provided good entertainment. But remember, the culture war began with both Republicans and Democrats attacking the New Left. Something had to change, and that went for radio too. Given the demographic bias inherent to the AM dial, everything was in place to set talk radio on its rightward drift, and this set up much of the rubric for upcoming media-driven politics. Bill Clinton won the '92 election, so now radio stations could run conservative shock jocks railing against the entire administration. Conservative hosts had fun, creating the current rhetoric for politicians. The point was to always be on the attack. If something positive was to be gained from Democrat legislation, conservative hosts called it hypocritical. If journalists wrote about something a conservative did wrong, they attacked journalists for their liberal bias. If they couldn't come up with a good counter-argument, then they'd just lie, creating an elaborate conspiracy theory about socialism.
I was wrong, I'm high.
Because I got high.
By the end of Clinton's presidency, the pattern was set. The biggest name among these hosts was Rush Limbaugh, and he dominated talk radio. During the '92 election, he could even boast that President Bush had personally carried his luggage into the White House. By the mid-90s, Ronald Reagan, who had become fairly secluded due to his Alzheimer's diagnosis, proclaimed Limbaugh was the new leader of American conservatism. Limbaugh's scathing attacks on Democrats were fun, though often based on maliciously falsified reporting. Truth didn't matter to Limbaugh and his ilk, just ratings. He was the outsider fighting against those crazy liberals, and there were many more like him, and they all hit their most shrill notes in the midterms, bolstering the Republican Revolution of 1994, and ultimately the congressional deadlock that's existed since then. But talk radio had to remain oppositional to keep up its ratings, so they attacked Republicans who were inadequately conservative according to them, turning even the most bipartisan of legislation into political minefields. They adapted a term that prior to the party switch referred to non-progressive Republicans and made it refer to liberal or moderate Republicans. That term was Republicans in name only, and the abbreviation was coined in 1992 as in rhinos. Now that Republicans held the Congress, conservative talk radio had rhinos to attack for entertainment as well. They made compromises on bills nearly impossible by poring over mundane negotiations. As Limbaugh would later say, "There's no common ground here. There is no bipartisanship to be had. Isn't gonna happen. There is no compromise. None. There is only concession. That's all that can happen, and that's what will happen." By turning every minor legislative step into a hazard, radio hosts contributed to congressional deadlock. Hosts even made Republican primaries perilous for incumbents. If they smelled a whiff of compromise or moderation from a given politician, then a primary challenger would gain all the positive coverage. They transformed Buckley's old rule that conservatives should vote for the rightward most viable candidate to simply just the rightward most candidate. In so doing, they broke down the gatekeepers' barricades of reasonable debate, creating a conservative echo chamber, all in the name of entertainment. Congressional deadlock during the 2012 fiscal cliff showed that Republicans under the rightward drift had lost all ability to govern, as conservative radio required purity rather than governance. By the Obama administration, Democrats wouldn't bother going on talk radio, but they would go on another politicized medium. Cable television had been commercially available since the 1950s, but it took time for the infrastructure and stations to make it a compelling product. In the 1970s, satellite television allowed the system to expand. Since it wasn't broadcast, fairness doctrine didn't apply. Political content was not an issue. For instance, televangelist Pat Robertson took his Christian Broadcasting Network onto cable in 1977 and quickly began far more explicitly religious right programming. 3 years later, CNN launched. As a 24-hour news station, it had to fill time. Soon they moved to holding editorial boards. It was either that or repeat content. These boards were intentionally balanced between conservative and liberal hosts, but for the most part, coverage remained the same kind of publicly trusted neutrality. This meant a lot of people found it quite stifling, especially as talk radio became popular in the 1990s. There were a number of other specialized news channels, including CNBC. In 1993, they promoted Roger Ailes to president. He was a savvy political operator, responsible for much of Nixon and Reagan's campaign commercials and media outreach. He had a plan. He spun off another channel called America's Talking, which played off the talk radio craze by doing it on TV.
The first ever daily national conversation. The excitement begins July 4th when we go online with the country's best talk.
Much like the Mannion Forum and Buckley's firing line before it. Unlike radio, this medium's impetus wasn't in a rightward direction. Quite the opposite, actually. Cable television was easier to access in the city. It had a naturally wider audience, which meant it had to serve more moderates, too. America's Talking hosts were purposefully mixed as liberal and conservative, but that eventually morphed into MSNBC by partnering with Microsoft to use internet-based journalism. This became a liberal counterpart to CNN's neutrality, but maintaining the assumption of moderation, which kept it boring. Throughout this transition, Ailes didn't remain in power. He was at greater and greater odds with liberals on set, one of whom made an official complaint to NBC saying Ailes called him a little fucking Jew prick. An investigation concluded that he'd behaved threateningly and regularly used slurs off-air. But before he could be fired, he quit. Instead, conservative mogul Rupert Murdoch hired Ailes to run a purely conservative network, Fox News. It was supposed to fairly balance the liberalism of MSNBC. But that entity was and is barely even left of CNN, while Fox News hastened to the right. Ailes brought in people who got their start in conservative talk radio, such as Glenn Beck, Laura Ingraham, and Sean Hannity. Their leading host, Bill O'Reilly, eventually created his own radio show in a kind of feedback loop of conservative media, which many have followed. Effectively, this imported radio's fiery rhetoric and eventually made Fox conservatism's leading outlet. It was the only purely political network, whereas MSNBC was somewhat liberal and CNN neutral to a fault. The answer to the conservatism displayed by Fox and radio came on cable, but not a news network. It was on Comedy Central. The Daily Show began in 1996, but did not have an apparent political leaning at first. That developed throughout the 2000s, with Jon Stewart at the reins. George Bush was president, and Fox News was increasingly sycophantic towards the administration. Lampooning them made for great comedy. Stewart took the rhetorical attack style of conservative radio and turned it around on them. From the example of The Daily Show, numerous other shows either spun off or changed to suit the style. For instance, The Colbert Report was a satire of Fox News, and when Colbert finished that, he moved on to late-night television, which had steadily implemented The Daily Show style. By the mid-2000s, there were openly partisan news and talk shows in either direction. They were already accelerating polarization. Fox and radio tugged rightward, CNN attempted to hold the status quo, and comedy shows nudged leftward. The civil debate of the new right and liberal consensus from before 1990 had given way to vitriol and partisanship. Thanks to technological trends,
I have come here tonight to plead to the mayor of Bullshit Mountain.
But the biggest change was still underway. While they had loosened the gates, it still took a great deal of production and backing to conduct these programs. The internet burst the gates wide open. The first major effect of the internet on politics was the creation of a new form of activism. Now people could use forums and mass text messaging. With the atomization of individuality from neoliberalism, this kind of decentralized organization was perfect for protests. It first manifested in 1999 with the anti-globalization movement. They showed up in droves to protest trade negotiations in Seattle. Since there was no leadership, protesters probably didn't realize that they were illegally blocking access to the conference, which resulted in a police crackdown, known as the Battle for Seattle. This set the precedent for future protests, which have mostly been decentralized and leaderless ever since. While it has been great for getting people out on the streets, it's been terrible for achieving goals. A couple years later, the use of technology changed drastically. Millions of Americans watched as the 9/11 terrorist attacks took 3,000 American lives. Suddenly there was a new wave of Islamophobia, and conservative radio gained much from stoking fear. In response, the US began our war on terror, and this has had massive consequences for political technology. In October, just as we were sending ground troops into Afghanistan, Congress passed the Patriot Act, granting the government a broad mandate to surveil communications tech. Even then, the Bush administration violated its limits, creating a warrantless data gathering program. While this officially ended in 2007, the NSA maintained and expanded much of this, which was only revealed in 2013 by Edward Snowden. Obviously, this inspired a great deal of conspiracism, and poisoned political discourse for years yet to come, all for a lackluster program that has hardly stopped any terrorism. But accusations of supporting terrorism drove the next severe political issue: Iraq. The Bush administration used the fear of another 9/11 to bolster support for militarily deposing Saddam Hussein. They claimed that he had kept weapons of mass destruction or manufactured new ones, despite a lack of evidence. A new round of decentralized protests sparked off, beginning in 2002, and they would continue for the next decade. Another internet phenomenon took political effect. That was the blogosphere. People started self-publishing online journals. Most made a negligible impact, save for a select few. some store clerk named Matt Drudge started aggregating news stories on his website, and he tended to favor conservative sources. This became the basis of other conservative sites, like Breitbart News or the Fox News spin-off Blaze Media. A year after Drudge made his website, Slate magazine began, which would become a liberal news source on the internet, before things like Huffington Post and BuzzFeed. This was new media, but it was merely an online version of old media. There was a different kind of new media that took on a social dimension. The internet has more social media sites than is worth going over them individually. Even before the web, there were bulletin boards in the 1980s, which were basically the predecessors of today's forums. All of today's giants got their start in the mid-2000s. 4chan began in 2003, Reddit and YouTube in 2005, Facebook becoming open to the public in 2006, and Twitter releasing that same year. Each took time to catch on, but they formed the social media landscape we occupy today, and they'd spell the ultimate end of gatekeeping. Social media democratized the internet by allowing anyone and everyone with an internet connection to post and interact online. That's what made it social media. Sure, there were rules, and moderation is certainly beginning to pick up, but it is nothing compared to the production requirements of old media. Social media democratized the internet, not immediately, but rapidly indeed. The founders of each website were unified in a single utopian vision. We might call it techno-libertarianism. These entrepreneurs honestly believed that by having no rules or minimal rules for their platforms, the best society would emerge. What tech entrepreneurs refused to see was the perverse incentives social media created. First and foremost was how this liberated media chooses what voices to raise. Techno-libertarians believed in what the Supreme Court once called the marketplace of ideas. How does one determine good ideas? Well, on the internet, that's by algorithm. Some go for simple interaction, keeping posts above the fold, like on 4chan, or up and down votes like on Reddit. Others have much more complex and inscrutable systems like here on YouTube. All award attention above all things. For libertarians, that attention economy is all that matters for determining popularity, and it's a very profitable ideal indeed. Incentivizing attention-grabbing posts means more user engagement and therefore more revenue. For all the idealism of libertarianism, it is still based on greed. As you can guess, that encourages extremism.
What kind of garbage is that? Oops, my anarchy symbol.
A perverse incentive underlying all social media interactions. This has changed our very relationship with truth. Since validation is far more likely to get interaction, it rises in the algorithm. The hard work of composing a good argument, arraying one's evidence, and using proper methodology is less appealing than eye-catching headlines and alluring idealism. Validation gains popularity, rendering the internet's epistemology more about interaction numbers on a given post than the actual truth, which allows for the rapid spread of misinformation and disinformation. Of course, the rapid spread of misinformation has put people's guards up in ways that do not yield truth. For instance, when reality doesn't meet someone's preconceptions, they find ways of denying it, such as complaining about someone's bias, as though that changes what's being presented. Everyone has a bias, but complaints like, "Keep your opinions and politics out of history," simply belie an unwillingness to deal with history itself, since it often cannot validate one's preconceptions. And that denial in and of itself is an attempt to validate other like-minded users, leading to a nexus of attention-grabbing disinformation. Of course, if one makes a mistake by trying to grab attention, they run into another issue. The internet is perpetual. Sometimes it's possible to delete a post, but often it's archived or re-uploaded. These posts are mostly public, meaning past mistakes are difficult to get over. Trying to silence them can result in the opposite. It's called the Streisand effect, named for when Barbra Streisand attempted to have images of her mansion removed, and people spread copies of it all over. So some choose to be anonymous instead. As the old joke goes, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. As numerous psychological studies have shown, people say things when anonymous that they'd never say in real life. They feel protected by their anonymity, even though oftentimes they are completely without it. The separation of being behind a screen is enough to confer this false confidence, which has led to a purely digital form of vigilantism. Rather than lynching like vigilantes once did, they revealed documents on users, thereby threatening their lives. It's called doxing. Once doxed, threats easily can be carried out, such as calling the police to falsely report a hostage situation at a target's house. This is swatting, because a SWAT team will likely breach that home and possibly kill the victim. Even something as mundane as losing one's job from doxing could be deadly, due to an inability to provide for one's livelihood. So internet anonymity simultaneously inspires extremism and violence. It doesn't help that digital vigilantes have a significantly reduced form of ethics. Because of the attention economy's incentivization of extremism, the mob has a less developed sense of morality than a typical grade schooler. People are quick to complain that it's just not fair. Woo!
Adolf says it isn't fair.
They see the world in black and white, allowing them to condemn any person as a whole for one supposedly bad opinion, often leading to advocacy of political violence against anyone they disagree with or even symbolizes something they dislike. For they've become so delusional as to have unlearned the elementary principle that two wrongs don't make a right. To cope with these issues of democratized media, people joked about it. Internet memes focused on the inherent silliness of caring about what's on the web. Everything turned into a parody of itself. This was a feedback loop, where the attention economy rewarded more sardonic takes, permanence made edginess always have to push new boundaries, and anonymity meant no consequences for going overboard. This was irony poisoning, where apathetic humor saturates our world so much that we cannot tell the difference between jokes and sincerely held beliefs anymore. People goaded each other to prompt a reaction, called trolling. These shitposts often took the form of extreme political positions, simply to troll people. Given that text has no intonation, this made it even more difficult to discern. It's known as Poe's Law. But there is solace from these problems. The internet is a community builder. People who used to only be able to connect through conventions and magazines can now find each other on social media. Some niche communities couldn't exist without this ability to connect over the internet, partially because they are so niche. Facebook especially, with its private groups and network of personal connections, allows people to congregate that normally would have lost touch.
But it is going to bother you because you're human, and I was human.
Of course, this means that older folks are more exposed to each other, and they often end up getting exposed to and spreading a great deal of misinformation. That's simply a side effect of being able to see so many people they once knew. While this has been great for beating back the inherent loneliness of neoliberal consumerism, it also has a dark underbelly. Hate groups that would have otherwise remained fractured and deep underground can connect, organize, and spread through social media. White supremacy did this effectively in the 1980s through bulletin boards, even creating their own previously impossible ties between groups like Klansmen and neo-Nazis, which would meet in northern Idaho at Aryan Nations. One attendee got in a shootout with feds at Ruby Ridge, not too far away. Then the Waco siege a year later was seen as part of another attack by what they called the Zionist-occupied government, or ZOG. Private militias sprung out throughout the country in the mid-90s, loosely associated with white supremacy through their internet connections. One militia movement participant took all the hatred to heart and decided to follow the advice of their manifesto, the Turner Diaries. On the 2-year anniversary of the Waco siege, he bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. The subsequent media scrutiny sent white supremacy underground again, but the internet kept them aware of each other. They even intentionally changed the term ZOG to New World Order, or NWO. It masked the open bigotry and submerged white supremacy in much of conspiracist lingo. They kept their bigotry alive through these niche communities, able to survive media scrutiny with the exact rhetoric pioneered by the likes of Rush Limbaugh. They became purveyors of formerly forbidden ideology. It was kind of a dark secret underlying reactionaries. They mixed with the ever-present anti-feminist and red-baiting hatred of the culture war. A group called the Manosphere adopted misogynist ideas for getting women. They formed the first step in going down this hatred rabbit hole called red pilling.
You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland.
and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
It pretends that people are unaware of the truth, and this is a way to wake up to it. You'd start off with simple pickup artistry, then complain how feminists are out to ruin Western culture, find hate groups like the white supremacist magazine American Renaissance, the white nationalist National Policy Institute, or the neo-Nazi Daily Stormer, and eventually spouting conspiracy theories about how Jews are trying to replace white people. This bigotry was an effect of the internet's community building, and we will return to that, but it is an example of how these communities can filter people into isolated bubbles. The algorithmic attention economy, post-permanence, anonymity, and niche communities leave us increasingly intellectually isolated. Filter bubbles are a natural outcome of the libertarian ethos social media was built upon, though it took a while before they became a constant. But there are simultaneously internet phenomena that fight against this. Perhaps the greatest of the ways people exceed their filter bubbles is hashtags. It creates a hyperlink allowing for topics to be spoken of en masse. Such a simple mechanic has inspired political movements that cut across filter bubbles. For instance, in opposition to police brutality that disproportionately affects black people, the hashtag Black Lives Matter started in 2013, but it didn't gain popularity until the Ferguson unrest of a year later. While there are several organizations that sprung up touting that name, it's a decentralized movement, much like anti-globalization a decade prior, kept going through the intersectional potential of hashtags. Another hashtag movement that's followed the same path was Me Too. It publicized women's accusations of sexual harassment and encouraged others to speak out. Both of these empowered its participants and engendered a national conversation, raising the voice of many who could not have spoken before. But while that's hopeful, the internet had already churned out a kind of rhetorical sanctimony that made it easy for conservatives to ignore. A blogging website called Tumblr gained popularity in the early 2010s. It became known for its political identity politics, filled with bad takes. They constantly complained of being marginalized by the forces of racism, sexism, elitism, and many more. Much was real, but most posts included ridiculous hyperbole and some were simply lying for attention. But what made Tumblr truly toxic was the way they turned to scolding people for not being woke enough. The term woke is essentially the same as red pilling, but for left-wing politics. It's the same idea that people are unaware, and that they might become more aware through a series of steps. This sanctimonious rhetoric of Tumblr purged people who did not display enough virtue for their echo chamber. As Tumblr declined over the last decade, their rhetoric found its way onto Twitter, where users can @ each other to post about one another. They could call out people they dislike, and continue the crusade against their supposed oppression. Much like media giants on the right and birchers before them, woke scolds took to attacking anything deemed impure. People would join in these attacks merely for entertainment, taking pleasure in knocking someone down a peg, regardless of the accusation's accuracy, turning these mobbings into witch hunts that harass anyone deemed impure. Their resentment is fulfilled only through public shaming, hence why Diogenes said, "Shamelessness is a virtue." As these attacks mounted in size and mobs formed to take part in the fun of disparaging individuals, these so-called cancellations utilized tools that crossed filter bubbles in order to remove people from entire websites, thereby negating the significance of those very tools. The reason for Tumblr's decline was self-imposed. Users gathered to attack another website who struck back tenfold, or should I say fourfold, for it was 4chan. The website is a bastion of reactionaries or even further right-wing bigotry, but it wasn't always that way. People who use the website are known as anons, for they don't have usernames. Sometimes a post gathers enough momentum to bring a large number of users into a raid. When they first started showing up in person, they took the anon moniker with them, wearing Guy Fawkes masks from V for Vendetta and calling themselves Anonymous. These raids were mostly pranks, like blocking the digital pool in an online game called Habbo Hotel, saying pools closed due to AIDS. Yes, they were edgelords, but they were mostly left-leaning. By 2008, they were a force to be reckoned with, coming to protest the Scientology cult. Dubbed by 4chan as Project Chanology, the physical protests were accompanied by digital raids, including a DDoS attack that took down Scientology's main website. Anonymous recognized their hacktivist power at this moment, and many Anons hatched a plan to keep up such tactics. Anonymous, as a hacktivist group, steadily migrated from 4chan to private chat servers called IRCs. Though they sometimes called upon assistance, such as during the Arab Spring when Anonymous attacked dictator servers, the left-leaning collective had essentially abandoned 4chan. This left the wild forum up for grabs, and the far-right quickly took advantage. The type of talk they classified as red-pilling corrupted the website steadily in the early 2010s. Until that point, the internet was resoundingly populated by liberals and techno-libertarians. Afterward, 4chan became the base for a rise in hate during the Obama administration. Helped along by the hatred of America's first black president and his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, these internet dwellers used upwelling hatred to recruit. Due to their open bigotry, they were too far right for even firebrands like Rush Limbaugh, so they dubbed themselves something else, an alternative to the new right. Coined in 2010 by white nationalist Richard Spencer, alt-right initially referred to anyone espousing rightist ideas deemed outside mainstream political discourse. Of course, they wanted to bring the mainstream further rightward with their extremism, which was somewhat successful. This was essential to ideas like red-pilling. Misogyny, chauvinism, and racism were key parts of the alt-right. After they gained publicity for their obvious connections to groups like neo-Nazis and Klansmen, they coined another term for those who used irony poisoning to avoid such obvious bigotry as quoting Hitler's 14 words. So misogynistic rightists like Mike Cernovich and the folks who appear on PragerU propaganda became known as the alt-light. This festered deep in the underbelly of sites like 4chan, YouTube, and Reddit until 2014 through a series of strange events. That August, a game journalist frustrated by a nasty breakup attacked his former girlfriend in what's dubbed the Zoe post, because her name was Zoe Quinn. A bit of an interjection here. As I edited this, I saw Innuendo Studios' video on Gamergate, good lecture by the way, and Quinn has come out as non-binary, but it's too late to change everything. So, anyways, he alleged she had slept with someone else to get a favorable review for her game Depression Quest. This was, of course, blatantly false, but that doesn't matter to the alt-right. He littered the Zoe post throughout 4chan, which eventually caught on. Channers attacked Quinn in the worst possible ways, to the point that she had to flee her residence for her life. On Twitter, some of these miscreants used the hashtag Gamergate to drum up support outside of the alt-right filter bubble. It caught on, not just for attacking Quinn, but anyone. You see, gamers had long defended their favored medium from spurious nonsense and attempts at censorship, like when people blamed games like Grand Theft Auto for spree murderers and wanted to legislate that away. Neoliberalism made people identify with video games, and this failed censorship made them feel like an oppressed class. They'd use Tumblr sanctimony against anyone they thought threatened their hobby turned marginalized identity. Just like woke scolds, they'd go much further to the point of bigotry. Many will claim Gamergate is about ethics in game journalism, but that's a lie.
What about the accusations of collusion between designers, feminists, and journalists? Do you understand how important it is? We are talking about ethics in gamer journalism. Do you understand how huge that is? I mean, what if there was no ethics in Hollywood journalism?
I think that that is a sort of compelling way to reframe the fact that this is actually attacks on women.
It began as a targeted hate campaign and remained as such for over a year. In fact, they still regularly harass people to this day, which means I might incur their wrath. I already foresee this being one of the episodes I need to disable comments on. I will not allow hate to be spread in my comments section.
This is the sonorous war cry of a very angry frog.
Much like how 4chan had defeated Tumblr earlier that year, Gamergate ultimately turned the internet rightward, just as radio and TV beforehand. There was a subreddit that directed many of these campaigns, but the focal point of Gamergate became YouTube. By 2015, it was quite lucrative to attack feminists who dared to criticize video games. Each new post brought a mob of hate mongers. Many of these YouTubers were steeped in attacking the weakest argument of their opponents, by having initially been internet atheists. With Christians, they'd attack creationists as though they were the whole, taking the talk radio model to excoriate them. With Gamergate, their target was feminists, whom they called social justice warriors, or SJWs. Just as with the term political correctness before it, this quickly lost any meaning of going after sanctimonious bigotry and simply turned into misogynistic and racist bigotry itself. These Gamergate anti-SJWs were a perfect recruiting tool for the alt-right. They were already espousing alt-right conspiracy theories like cultural Marxism, where they said that Marxists, or more explicitly, Jews, were attacking Western culture itself, even though by definition they were part of Western culture. As with red pilling, it belied a descent into bigotry, and YouTube happily housed it for years. In 2016, a series of news articles exposed that YouTube ran ads on terrorist and hateful content. YouTube implemented their demonetization program, which ended up barely even affecting the worst offenders. The few terrorist videos that got demonetized paled in comparison to their use of the policy against things like educational content, which, by the way, this video might very well get demonetized. One in this series already has, and they might even age restrict it.
Biggity, 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 bot.
And this kind of crackdown simply inspires more hatred, not less. But the main reason why this 2016 policy change didn't affect the alt-right was that they've moved on from Gamergate. Breitbart News, under Steve Bannon, had used the popularity of Gamergate to declare the publication was the platform of the alt-right. And Bannon would go on to become the chief executive for a Republican presidential candidate. The presidential election of that year would galvanize all these technological polarization forces, everyone arrayed on either side of the divide. For Democrat Hillary Clinton, you had the likes of MSNBC, Slate, The Daily Show, and Tumblr turned to Twitter. But she was a clear representation of the establishment, which both left and right populists opposed.
But I'm trying to figure out how we get them to have Pokemon go to the polls.
A political outsider arose in December of 2015. Or should I say descended, for he came down his golden escalator. Donald Trump began his campaign for president with a kind of demagoguery that spoke to anti-SJWs, the alt-right, and conservative media hosts. In his announcement speech, he said,
"When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people."
This fusillade contained numerous other hateful clips, which would permeate his campaign. Every week there was a new scandal. Even when he insulted veterans on multiple occasions, a once holy cow for conservatives, he managed to clinch the Republican primaries rather handily. Even when his infamously misogynistic clip released,
and when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy.
This October surprise had regular Republicans denouncing it, yet with every hateful comment, Trump gained popularity overall, eventually winning the election nonetheless. He didn't win the popular vote, but the last newly elected Republican to do that was in 1988. Many have puzzled over how such a demagogue could ascend to the presidency. The most cogent analyses have focused on white laborers or rural populations who felt unrepresented. But with this longer view, we can see that it is his demagoguery itself that got him elected. By 2016, we were so polarized that someone spewing hatred was exactly what people wanted. It didn't matter what kind of hatred he spewed, just that he was spewing it. Trump's call for building a border wall,
build that wall, build that wall, build that wall,
draining the DC swamp, as in removing an establishment of technocratic insiders, and jailing his opponents,
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
Were less about actual policy, after all, he did none of those things, and were really about drumming up hatred of foreigners, welfare or social programs, and Democrats. Demagoguery simply means political activity or practices that seek support by appealing to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people rather than by using rational argument. Or basically someone who marshals hatred for support. Conservative media and the alt-right were perfect exporters of Trump's demagoguery. When he insulted veterans...
He's not a war hero.
He's a war hero.
He's a war hero.
5.5 years.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you. I always wanted to get the Purple Heart. This was much easier.
They said he was being strawmanned. When the misogynistic clip played, they said the media was biased and hypocritical. Radio and Fox News were well practiced at these diversionary tactics. Online, hate has ruled discourse since Gamergate. When Hillary called Trump's followers a basket of deplorables...
You know, to just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
They accepted the moniker and mocked her supporters incessantly for the gaffe. Whatever Trump actually stood for, it didn't matter. His constant race-baiting and reactionary rhetoric, thrown several times a day from his personal Twitter account, gained news coverage, and hate flowed freely. Once elected, the alt-right celebrated.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
They brought their men to the highest office in the land. Borrowing Hillary's gaffe, they gathered at what they called the deplorable. But much like during Clinton's presidency, open hatred couldn't last. Only 6 months after Trump's inauguration, people gathered to save a Confederate statue from removal. But this rally had grander ambitions.
It's an attack on European history, on white history. It's also symbolic of a greater desire to erase us.
It was titled Unite the Right. They wanted to bring the disparate elements of the alt-right together. As with any extremists, they'd been prone to infighting. Many key figures showed up, including Richard Spencer, to show the alt-right's connection to forefather white supremacist organizations from the pre-Oklahoma City days. Former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, David Duke, prominently participated. Counter-protesters met them in the streets and rightists attacked them incessantly, including driving a car into the crowd, killing Heather Heyer. Trump, of course, continued to stoke hatred afterwards, despite being president.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides. What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt? You had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. And nobody wants to say that, but I'll say it right now.
This sent the alt-right scurrying underground, just like after Oklahoma City. But unlike that, they'd re-emerged like cockroaches after the rain, thanks in large part to the president's constant demagoguery and social media's perverse incentives. Before his 2016 run, he'd been the lead conspiracist of the racist theory that Obama was a secret Kenyan Muslim. Trump denied climate change and made prominent connections with InfoWars, who espouse all kind of denialism, including 9/11 truthers and disparaging mass shooting survivors. The internet and conservative media had allowed conspiracism to gain popularity. This conspiracism followed Trump into the Oval Office. His press secretary, Sean Spicer, denied the size of the inauguration crowds on his first day, and another representative, Kellyanne Conway, stated that the falsehood was simply alternative facts.
You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
Whenever fact-checkers disproved the Trump administration, they'd call it fake news.
We are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are.
This became so prominent that people started calling it the post-truth world. But conspiracism is innately violent after all, for one can only deny the truth for so long until they have to coerce their incoherent worldview into reality. As Voltaire said, truly whoever can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. It was already prominent online, and soon it permeated all forms of political speech. It's not like conspiracism hadn't already existed. Birchers were the most prominent conservatives in 1964 after all, and conservative media was filled with it by 2016. But this was on an unprecedented scale. Even liberals embraced conspiracy theories, such as the CIA sending drugs into ghettos, killing JFK and MLK, planning 9/11, and Russia directly running Trump as a Manchurian candidate. Conspiracism is bigotry against the victims of whatever tragedy they're lying about, and the right does not hold a monopoly on it. The sad thing is, by Trump's inauguration, we were too polarized to fix the situation. On talk shows, whenever people bothered to fight conspiracism, they were struck down as batting for the other side. The American body politic had lost all sanity. This was an unthinkable state of affairs prior to talk radio, and now it's the norm. One of the most pernicious ones was called Pizzagate. It claimed that the establishment politicians were colluding to abuse children by ordering from a pizza joint. A conspiracist even went so far as to attack the supposedly responsible restaurant. Pizzagate fell apart, but someone revived it, claiming to have a Department of Energy Q clearance on 4chan. He claimed Trump would crack down on these fictitious pedophiles. This was absurd on the face of it. This began on 4chan, though it would move on to 8chan, a more extreme version of 4chan. But because they're called Anons, this conspiracy theory became known as QAnon. These conspiracists fell down the rabbit hole of hatred like so many red pillars before them. But the entire focal point of these was Trump as some kind of savior, and anyone who opposed his demagoguery were somehow pedophiles, or apologists for them. I'm sure there's some people trying to type that in the comments below, but they'll get banned, sure enough. Essentially, QAnon became Trump's sycophants.
Well, I don't know much about the movement other than I understand they like me very much, which I appreciate, but I don't know.
They'd play a significant role in his final year as president. 2020 was a crazy year by any measure. A pandemic unlike anything we've seen in generations came from China. It shuttered businesses and quarantined the entire population for months. On top of that, Trump's constant prevarications led to an inadequate response to the novel coronavirus, along with an explosion of denialists, hoarding, and anti-vaxxers. The US had the worst initial outbreak in the developed world. As of writing this, there are more than 600,000 Americans dead. Being stuck inside, we all moved online to social media for our normal interactions, automatically incurring its perverse incentive structure. Obviously, this increased tensions enough, but things grew worse. Footage of a black man named George Floyd surfaced, showing Minneapolis police killing him steadily by kneeling on him over several minutes. People erupted into the streets during a pandemic to protest. Black Lives Matter resurged along with attention on numerous other cases of police brutality. Some resorted to rioting, as we've seen with so many other decentralized protests. Of course, the riots were easy fodder for conservatives to claim protesters were really terrorists, including the president himself. This round of race riots took more than 20 lives over the course of 2020, but rightists countered with their own violence. Militia members protected businesses and attacked protesters as though they were rioters. Just like vigilantes, they took the law into their own hands. One of these self-appointed guards was a teenager who ended up shooting 3 people in self-defense, killing 2, all with an illegally possessed weapon. The most prominent of these militia groups were the Proud Boys, a self-proclaimed Western chauvinist organization.
We're the Proud Boys, and we're Western chauvinists, and we refuse to apologize for creating the modern world.
Along with other resurgent private militias aligned with QAnon, they'd play an outsized role in events to come. The election that year was disturbing to say the least. It was almost a repeat of 2016, but with Trump using far more extreme demagoguery than before, and the Democratic candidate, Biden, at even more of a centrist position than Hillary. But Trump stoked hatred like he always had, using red-baiting rhetoric to call Biden a socialist, using the riots to dismiss Black Lives Matter issues, and even refusing to denounce white supremacy by telling the Proud Boys to
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
A phrase white supremacists quickly adopted, of course. Luckily, this time he lost not only the popular vote, but the electoral one. After all this craziness, a record turnout showed up, not only for Biden, but also for Trump. It was a tense counting period, especially because of the pandemic, but after a week, the winner was clearly Biden. Trump, being the sore loser he always has been, refused to accept the results.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
He made wild claims of voter fraud, spinning yet another conspiracy theory of Democratic rigging. He'd said the same crap about the 2016 election, even creating a presidential investigation attempting to prove his erroneous claims. This time he had QAnon, conservative media, and the arrayed forces of the alt-right to back him up. Election conspiracism swirled in a potent pot of hatred. They couldn't stand by any longer. Trump's numerous challenges and actual attempted conspiracies to overthrow the election failed. But he did what he did best: demagoguery. He filled the entire lame duck period with tweet after tweet of conspiracism. When it came to certify the election, he held a rally to push the conspiracy theory even further.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Let's have trial by combat. Well, we came this far. What do you say? Drag him out! Here's a picture we lost our life.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special.
5 people died that day, including one of the Capitol defenders. Despite much denialism since, January 6th was an insurrection. Denying such is just another game of rightists, and I'll have absolutely none of it in the comments section. By decree of King Richard I, bigots get banned.
He's being oppressed. And the Stegelhausen and the
He says it's an outrage.
Quiet!
It is the right of the platform holder to control what happens on their property, after all, which goes just the same for social media as a whole. You may kick someone out of your house. That is part of your right to free speech, as is social media to remove people from their platforms. They are all private companies, so they acted in response to January 6th by deplatforming the president himself. This violates their techno-libertarian ethics, revealing a menacing future where private platforms hold control over who is or is not allowed to speak, despite them being the most public of spaces. It is a conundrum we will long have to grapple with. They've created this problem, allowing bigotry to fester.
I just fucking got myself. I just fucking got myself. Got myself. Got myself. I just fucking got myself.
And deplatforming appears to be just another band-aid on top of a massive wound. Unfortunately, bigotry is simply a part of our political system now. We've seen congressional deadlock ever since, even in trying to investigate the insurrection itself. Democrats only have half the Senate, and so cannot get anything substantive passed. And that is where I shall leave this story having brought it all the way to the present. It's anyone's guess where we will go from here. Maybe the capital siege will inspire the beginning of a steady change towards progress again, just like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. predicted. Or perhaps we'll just become more and more polarized, and not learn our lesson. I'm a historian, not a fortune teller. The future is always uncertain. At the very least, we can be aware of what brought us to this point. One thing is for certain, we've chosen this fate. The party switch set us on this path. The culture war furnished dishonest rhetoric for Reaganites to take over. Neoliberalism was Reagan's economic policy that sowed the discontent we've polarized over since 2011, and technology accelerated that polarization to the point of disrupting the peaceful transition of power, which has differentiated us from so many failing countries before. We cannot look at one event or issue throughout this entire series and say that is where it all began. Polarization has been a steady process throughout the sixth party system. The question is, will we continue to fail, or will we learn from our mistakes and institute a new progressive era? Who knows? The best we can do is discuss and learn from the past, as history is so useful for. To wrap up this series, I am going to be making a kind of editorial diatribe. It'll be mostly just me talking about what we can do, what we should do, and all those kinds of things. So be sure to subscribe for that, and I'll see y'all next time.